CleanTX, and I have the privilege of moderating a webinar, which is a reprise of the last session we did several months ago. We were looking at the climate action plans from various of the larger cities in Texas. We had so many people on the last call and so much interest after the call that we were asked if we would bring back those panelists again to dig even deeper into some of those topics. And so in the preparation call, I just had a great time talking with people and discussing, what's even happened since the last time. And Laura, for example, Cottingham, you can't see her, but she's on the phone. Since then, they actually had their Climate Action Week where they had a whole week of webinars laying out different aspects of the programs. Other cities are moving forward. And so today, I have the pleasure of having with me Katie Evans from the city of Dallas, Laura Cottingham from Houston, the one you can't see, but she's most assuredly here, Zach Bommer from Austin, Doug Milnick from San Antonio, and then Ben Hubbard, who's the CEO of Nexus PMG, who is a company that helps a lot of cities get projects done, lining up money, et cetera. And so we'll delve into the challenges and the opportunities in the climate action plans, and then Ben will provide us with some context in terms of what can actually be done physically on the ground. So what I like to do is start with having each panelist introduce themselves for a couple minutes about what they're doing, some of the salient parts of the program they're working on. And so we'll do that for the first couple minutes to create the on-ramp, and then we'll launch into the discussion. Katie, you happen to be the largest face on the screen right now, so I'm going to start with you. If you can just basically tell us for a couple minutes, what you're doing there, your title, what you're doing at the city of Dallas, and what you want to talk about today a little bit.
Sure. I guess that's as good a reason as any to kick things off that I'm the big head on the screen. My name is Katie Evans. I'm a climate coordinator for City of Dallas. And the City of Dallas passed on May 27 the first ever City of Dallas Comprehensive Environmental and Climate Action Plan, or CCAP. Our council passed it unanimously. And so we are now moving into the implementation phase of this massive plan. It's got 97 actions across 8 sectors or goals, with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well as improving life overall for Dallas residents. So our focus right now is putting together our implementation work plan and setting ourselves up for success down the line.
Great, and only 97 actions. That sounds like a piece of cake.
No problem.
Thank you. Laura, if you could kindly introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what the exciting things that are happening in Houston right now.
All right, thank you so much. So I am Laura Cottingham. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Houston. And very similarly to Dallas, the City of Houston launched its very first climate action plan on April 22nd. And, fun fact that the cities really all do talk together. And so we were all comparing notes during all of this, and that it happened during the pandemic. And so we're also in implementation of the Climate Action Plan, which has 96 actions. So I got to figure out the one thing that Dallas has that we don't have and maybe add one. But since that plan was launched, we held the virtual Houston Climate Week here in Houston to really give folks a deep dive to learn more about the Climate Action Plan. And we're super excited at the response that we got. Over 5,000 Houstonians had registered for various events, and it's all available online if anyone wants to learn more. Our Climate Action Plan is actually on agenda today as we speak for council approval and officially establishing climate and sustainability as a function of the City of Houston. So that's exciting for us, but the plan was the easy part. Implementing it will be the hard part. And so that is going to be the name of the game in Houston going forward.
Thanks. And the launch of your Climate Week was delayed by the inauspicious landing of a hurricane in the middle of that whole thing, pointing out the need for these types of activities, unfortunately. Zach, if we can turn to you next.
Yeah. I'm Zach Bommer. I'm the Climate Program Manager here at the City of Austin, Texas. I've been with the city since 2011, and our first climate plan was passed back in 2015, and so we sort of went five years of implementing that original plan. Then in 2019, we started revising that plan and coming up with a new edition. So I've been working with stakeholders over the last year to come up with a version 2.0 of our climate plan. And that new plan is called the Austin Climate Equity Plan. We're in the final stages of completing it and taking all of our comments and revising it. We're hoping to bring it to City Council in November for adoption. And then after adoption in November, we would, as the other cities have sort of move into a new phase of implementation. So that's kind of where we are right now. Yeah.
Yeah, we just got feedback. Are other people hearing that echo from Zach? Okay, there we go. Thank you. Ben, if we can turn to you, what's going on at Nexus PMG? How do you tie into this conversation?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks, Peter, for hosting this. Really appreciate everything you do. You're quite good at this, so we really enjoy working with you in these fashions. Nexus PMG is also really proud to sponsor this particular webinar. We're an interesting group in that the dynamic we provide here around this conversation is more on the implementation side. So we specialize in advising cities, municipalities. We do a lot of work with infrastructure funds, private equity firms, and the bondholder agencies, et cetera, on essentially developing and bringing a lot of projects to life in the ESG sector. So everything from waste to value to hydrogen production. We're doing a lot in sustainable agriculture, energy transformation, things of that nature. So we have lots of folks who specialize in the development of these projects, from doing engineering in-house all the way through, the financial advisory services on financial modeling. We partner a lot of municipalities and a lot of private developers up with financing community in order to get projects connected between those two appropriate parties based on the projects themselves. And so we kind of play more on the implementation side and work with a lot of the folks on this conversation and maybe others listening, and helping to ensure that these goals are met, once their aggressive targets are established.
Great, thank you. And then certainly, last but not least, in San Antonio, Doug Melnick. Doug, can you also introduce yourself? Give us a little bit of the background, what you're working on down there?
Sure, thank you. Doug Melnick, Chief Sustainability Officer with the City of San Antonio. Our climate action and adaptation plan was adopted last October, and so we were, all ramped up to start implementing, and some things came up that we're all dealing with. And so I think it's been really an interesting year trying to move the plan forward, given other priorities. Like my other colleagues, there's a million balls in the air, what we've been working on is, trying to take this big plan that needs to be implemented really quickly and start building accountability measures. It's not enough to just pass a plan, but how are we tracking progress? How are we ensuring that we as a department, we as an organization are being held accountable? So I'll talk more about this going forward, but it's a combination of on-the-ground projects, working with partner organizations, and building a community and organizational understanding of the what and whys of this, because it's not enough just to pass a plan.
So Doug, so we've got 97 projects in one city, in Dallas, 96 in Houston. You've got a ton. How do you track it all? Is it in spreadsheets, or is it in some kind of how do you make sure you're advancing the ball forward with all these different complexities and interactions? That just must be a Herculean task to stay on top of it all when you're asked to report to City Council and the powers that be. How does that work?
Yeah. So our plan, similar to other plans, takes all of those actions and breaks them down into time frames. There's immediate short-term actions, midterm actions, long-term actions. Those priorities were determined based upon carbon reduction potential, based upon resources currently being available. So we have a priority list that we're focused on now, I think the trick is also keeping an eye open for other opportunities that may pop up. A funding opportunity may pop up from the federal government that we need to be prepared to jump on. And then in terms of letting the community and the council know, we have an online dashboard, particularly for our mitigation actions, where anybody can go on and just see the status. Has the strategy been initiated? Is it on hold? Has it been completed? We also provide annual updates to the community and council. I think the big thing that we do and other cities do is it's that greenhouse gas inventory. We're currently completing our 2019 inventory and hoping to have that done by the end of the year, and that's going to be the real litmus test, because what has happened over the 3 years from our 2016 inventory. It's enough to have talk, have plans, to implement strategies, but if the numbers aren't going down, if our emissions aren't going down quickly enough, we need to reevaluate where we are.
Great, thank you. By the way, being the bad moderator that I just found out I am, I forgot to mention that after the 90 minutes of conversation among the team, for the last half hour, we'll open it up to all the folks who are listening. And last time, we actually had so many questions and such an interesting conversation. We wanted to make sure we had time at the end for that. So I apologize for not having mentioned that before. In the prep call, Katie, we were talking about this, and Zach and Lara as well. Well, Doug wasn't on, but we just passed notes back and forth and talked about it. The role of the cities came up, and each one of you mentioned that some people sort of expect the city to be this godlike figure that can do everything and address every single potential need out there. And so I wanted to delve a little bit into this topic about what the role of the city can and probably should be in this conversation. What should the role of that municipal entity, and in particular your office, be? And Laura, you had made a comment that with respect to, for example, flood control and that sort of thing, folks were looking to you, but that wasn't within your aegis. Can you amplify a little bit what we were talking about in the prep call on that?
Absolutely. So the role of a sustainability office and climate change and climate action and climate equity is different in every city. But in every city, it's a pretty big catch-all term. And so in Houston, one of the things that I have come to realize is that we have to do a really good job of clarifying who does what within the city and within the community, that there are so many issues going on in Houston with respect to climate, and flooding is almost always the first thing on everyone's list because we have such a history of flooding, and that it's not a question of if but when, and now it's a question of how many times per year, it seems like, and that 20 different agencies are working on flooding in Houston. And so that's not specifically in the Climate Action Plan. That's not something the CAP addresses because there's so many other works. We also have a resilience strategy. We have a green stormwater infrastructure. We have a recovery office and a resilience office. So the Climate Action Plan really focuses on greenhouse gas mitigation because we have the job of saying no matter how much work we do on flooding and no matter how much work we do on adaptation, if we don't get at that mitigation goal, if we don't reduce those emissions, we're always going to be behind the ball.
Thank you. Zach, what's in and out of bounds for you and your office in terms of delimiting what the responsibilities and possibilities are?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing that we ask is like, where does the city actually have the control to like make the direct change? And so in Austin, we're in a unique situation where the city owns and controls Austin Energy. So there's a lot of things that we can do controlling, energy efficiency programs, electric vehicle programs, solar programs, the entire generation mix of the utility. All of that is within our direct control, which is a sort of unique thing for us. So in Austin, our stakeholders have been pushing on those levers with our city council and with the utility, for a decade and making a lot of progress. But then, you know, the second largest and soon to be the very largest sector of emissions is transportation. Mm-hmm. And in transportation, you know, we have some levers, like, you know, we have levers related to roads and related to parking and related to infrastructure and zoning and development. But at the same time, like all of the, you know, we don't control Capital Metro, who runs the public transportation system, and we don't control all of the individual actors that are buying cars at car dealerships and driving around every single day. So that's just one example of like where it gets really challenging. Like we're setting a goal to try to reduce transportation emissions and trying to implement different projects and programs, but that's not going, it's not going to, we don't have all of the levers and all the control to actually fix, you know, immediately fix all those things. And so then you get into the space of like, and then even, you know, the Office of Sustainability, you know, we have a transportation department, we have a public works department. Like there's a lot of other pieces within the city, you know, the city ecosystem that we're trying to affect. And so, you know, it's just challenging when we don't hold all the levers to make all the changes. And so there has to be a lot of convincing and coercion and trying to incentivize people and motivate people. And sometimes those things work and sometimes they don't work. And so that's a lot of the challenge for us when it comes to control.
Do some of those other agencies, do they have carbon goals?
Like in our city, our transportation department they have a strategic mobility plan that has goals around commute trip, mode shift, and around reducing traffic congestion. And they take carbon into account, but no, they don't have a direct goal for carbon emissions reduction, because I think that they see that it's out of their control and that's not sort of their directive. And so part of this, again, is like working with stakeholders to and try to make sure that our city council makes it clear to departments and makes it clear that like what's important and what's not important and who has goals, et cetera. And that, you know, and then to what Doug said, try to get an accountability loop going of like, well, if council supports this carbon reduction goal, then they need to actually like try to work in all of their spheres of influence to hold up these targets, because it's not about just me or us measuring one goal. It's way bigger than that.
Thank you. Katie, I saw you nodding there, which is an invitation to ask you, like, are you in meetings, coordination meetings with other departments all the time, so that the city as a whole, as some kind of organic entity, marches forward, or how does that actually take place with the 97 goals that you have? You must be on the phone or in virtual meetings all day long. What does your day look and feel like?
Yeah, so it is a lot of coordination with other departments. So what we've done to facilitate that is develop an internal coordination group with representatives from every department. The nice thing about CCAP and the timing of it is well timed with other master plans that are moving forward. We have an update to our land use plan. We also have a strategic mobility plan. We have a lot of things that are happening at the same time. So working with those departments to make sure that the goals of those plans align with CCAP and that both plans move each other forward in the same direction is really important. So with this internal coordination group, we're working very closely with them to make sure that our work plan is not just aggressive, but feasible. You know, we want to make sure that our plan is realistic and aligns with the program's priorities and budgets of the other departments. We want to make sure we're set up for success. So yes, a lot of that is talking with other departments, using those liaisons to facilitate those connections and making sure we're all on the same page with implementation.
I have to imagine interpersonal and political skills are a prerequisite for the job.
Yeah, so I am fairly new to the city of Dallas. I came from a much smaller city just a few months ago, and the number of people involved in the implementation of a plan like this is massive, especially compared to what I was used to. And so it's a lot of coordination. It's a lot of making sure that everyone knows what each other is doing. So as simple as benchmarking energy for city facilities isn't as straightforward as you would think it would be, because of the sheer number of city facilities and then the responsibility for those facilities lying with various departments, not just one overarching group. So it's a lot of managing those relationships and making sure that we are all working towards the same goals.
Thanks. Doug, I had this opportunity to chat with Paula Gold-Williams at CPS because I've just finished up a book, and she's in the last chapter in terms of how to move forward. And she was discussing the challenge, which we discussed a little bit last time around, well, the city develops these carbon goals and we get them from the city. And then we've got to figure out how to implement those, bearing in mind that we've made these investments, some of them that last 30 years, that have impacts on ratepayers. And I have to think CPS is one of the largest sectors in your area, as it is in Austin, and not so with Dallas and Houston, where they don't have that sort of direct link with the utility. What's that conversation like in terms of looking at the emissions, for example, in the utility and trying to work with them to figure out how to drive those numbers down and fit that within your overall strategy?
Yeah. Do I look frozen or am I moving? I can't tell, but whatever.
You look frozen, but we can hear you fine.
All right, good. So I'm going to sort of go back to something that Zach had mentioned, transportation. There's no one lever to hit our carbon reduction goal. And we have CPS Energy. The energy that they're providing to our buildings accounts for a significant amount of our greenhouse gas emissions. The carbon intensity of the grid has been going down, but when we look at our transportation sector, that's going up. So I think the first step is really as a community understanding what the trends are and where the big areas of concern are. So I think I think where it's very easy to say, okay, well, CPS, we need to do more. We can't forget about transportation, which in San Antonio is about 48% of our emissions. So that's an important point. But in terms of working with CPS, I think the other thing is, and it was mentioned earlier, this just can't be a city plan. We need to work with CPS, with our other institutional partners, with our university partners. Everyone needs to have a plan in place. Everyone needs to have a commitment to reduce emissions. Otherwise, we are not going to hit our community reduction targets. I think in terms of working with CPS specifically, I think it's just continuing to make sure that they know that they are on board with what that target is, that they are doing everything they can to do the cost-benefit analysis to ensure that we're driving down the carbon intensity of the grid while at the same time being sensitive to what it means to our most vulnerable populations. We really need to look at rates. We really need to look at who's going to bear the burden of transitioning away from those existing fossil fuel plants. So I wish there was an easy answer to it, and I don't think there is.
No.
I think we're all hoping that technology continues to accelerate to where we need it to be, so the cost effectiveness of retiring some of these fossil fuel plants that are relatively new becomes more cost effective.
Thanks. So you kind of got my mind going on this one, and in our prep call, we were moving in this direction as well. And Katie, you alluded to the 97, and you got all these different initiatives. Each one has a carbon tag associated with it. Some of them are much more complex than other ones are. How do you set the priorities? Do you shoot for early wins, or is it dollars per ton, or how do you decide which of those, to use Zach's word, levers, for example, are you pulling the hardest on? Because you kind of can't do them all with equal fervor and intensity. Can you? And so, Katie, you're big in the picture right now, and you raised the 97 goals, so I got you right now. How do you think about setting the priorities and figuring out when something's sort of done and whether you move into phase two and move all that along? It must be a very dynamic process.
Sure. So in our year one implementation work plan right now, we have 46 of the 97 actions scheduled for initiation this fiscal year. And the way we looked at it is a number of the actions in the plan are ongoing. They include programs and policies that were in place when the plan was adopted and will continue basically in perpetuity, right? And so those actions are important, and they're important for programs to build off of, right? So we've decided that in year one, we want to focus on building capacity. And so we've selected actions that really lend themselves towards pilot projects and proofs of concept. So we want to make sure that the city, going back to your question earlier about the city's role, we want the city to function as a leader and to lead by example. And so some of that is facilitating those partnerships, developing proofs of concepts, and really moving forward the education piece. So we want to build the social will and really begin with that behavioral change as a foundation for more aggressive actions later on. So really the CCAP is meant to be layered, and starting with that building capacity and that foundational selection of actions is the route we went with for year one implementation. It's tricky. We did not cherry pick the actions either. We went all in. We've got actions selected from every one of the 8 sectors, and it's really representative of the plan as a whole. But yeah, you have to start somewhere, right? And so some of it is those quote unquote quick wins, and some of it is the foundation for actions that are going to take years to fully implement. And as far as when things are done versus are they ever done, yeah, some of these actions are going to go on forever, right? You can't ever be done with some of these emissions reducing actions. And then others are fairly straightforward. You know, you pass an ordinance, that's done, right? Others we're going to be implementing for years to come.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll move into the money side. So Laura, you've got the 5 pillars in the Houston plan. Some of them involve things like electrification or moving away from internal combustion engines. That must involve some sensitivities for all of you. I mean, there are winners and losers in this transition game. So, Laura, I hope I can't see you, but I'm directing this question to you. How do you deal with some of these political sensitivities? Because obviously transition sometimes involves pain and winners and losers. So how do you think about those things, and how do you deal with them politically?
Definitely. And I would say that when we started the Climate Action Plan process 2 years ago, talking about climate in Houston, you could just feel that it was a very touchy subject, and that I am happy to say we've come a long way. That if you were listening to the City Council discussion that's going on right now, you could see that there's still some questions, but that the idea of a global energy transition, that everything that has happened in the past 2 years, all of the climate events that every single city is facing, all of the shareholder movement, the incredible youth movement around climate, that what you're seeing is the community is really coming closer together on this subject, and that everyone wants to know how they can do their part. It means a little bit different in Houston because we are this proud energy capital of the world, and that our economy has oftentimes been exceedingly focused around fossil fuels. And so the idea that we want to decarbonize was originally seen as very threatening, and now it's being seen a little bit more as a challenge and even an opportunity, because every day more and more companies are talking about how they are accepting the Paris Agreement goals. They are going to decarbonize by 2050. That the Climate Action Plan is not about moving Houston away from the energy industry. It's about moving the energy industry forward and how Houston can lead that. So it's definitely a work in progress, right? It's a discussion that we are going to have to keep having over and over again. But what's really inspiring is that when we first started, I oftentimes felt like the city was one of the first groups to really stick its neck out there and start that conversation. And that so many entities, businesses, parts of our community have joined since then, and that it means more when you see businesses standing up in our community with those same goals. So, they're making commitments is great, but the proof is in the pudding. We have to actually act on them. And so that's what we're all looking to right now, is to say, okay, we've all committed. How and where do we make those first steps? And are they low-hanging fruit, or are we shooting for the moon? Are we making big, bold gestures?
Okay, so low-hanging fruit. I have to ask this question because we talked about it in the prep call, and because the book is right over Katie's shoulder there, a switch. And in that book, they talk about two examples where if you had, for example, two credit card accounts out there, and one of them you only had $500, but the card company was charging you 3%. Another one you had $5,000, and the card company was charging you 20%. An economist would say, start to knock down the 20% one because that's what you're paying so much for. But in that book, Switch, they say, no, there's a habit of winning that you develop. Go after some of those low-hanging fruits to win, and then potentially build some communications around that and get some momentum going. How does that in the psychology of what you're working on, is the low-hanging fruit helpful to go after just to let people know that you're able to knock some of these targets off? Katie, since you got the book right there, I'll ask you, how do you think about things like that, just in terms of developing that habit of winning?
So in the interest of full disclosure, I bought the book after you recommended it during the prep call. So there's not even dust on the book jacket yet, so I'm not ready. But yeah, I think as long as you're not only going for the low-hanging fruit, as long as you're taking some bites out of the whale, so to speak, too, I think low-hanging fruit is great for morale. It's great for the public to see that you're making progress. It's cost-effective, right? But, if in 5 years, all we've got is a bushel of apples, so to speak, to carry the metaphor, and we haven't chipped away at any of the bigger, more impactful projects, then that's probably not the best way to go. But yes, absolutely. I think those easier, quick wins, absolutely great for morale and good for PR and just really helpful to show that we are making progress, even in an environment like we're in right now, where maybe money is a little bit tighter.
Perfect segue, money. We talked about this before, that funding, cities don't have blank checkbooks. They have a bully pulpit. They can lead by example. They can coordinate and marshal. But, that they're particularly now with all the COVID funding and limited budgets and so on, this is a tough time. So this is where I think we can segue and turn the conversation to Ben, who's been politely and quietly sitting there waiting for me to ask him a question. So you mentioned before we got on the call today that specific projects are out there with funders looking to move those things forward because they perceive economic opportunities. Can you discuss a little bit what that financial landscape looks like right now, and what sorts of projects are particularly attractive to investors in this climate sustainability milieu, if you will, context?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have an interesting viewpoint, just because I get to talk to so many different funds and so many different private equity firms and leaders. And the interesting thing is I think what's driving a lot of these sectors, and which I think will make it easier for Katie, Zach, Doug, and Laura over time, is that this is where the money wants to go. But it's not just going there because it's the right thing to do. It's going there because the returns are proving to be actually better than the alternatives. You just look over the last 2 or 3 years in particular in the stock market and even in the private sector, ESG-based investments have beat every other investment by north of 175 basis points. So it's making not only financial sense, and I think all of us around this table realize that where the money goes, the markets go. It's just kind of the natural, the way that capitalism thrives, right? And you're seeing more and more money pour into these sectors because of two reasons. One, I think there is just an overarching movement occurring for, okay, it's time. All right, we've kicked the can long enough. It's time to pick the can up and do something about the issues that we're facing. But the other part of that is technology has advanced. The knowledge of the circular economy and the benefits that can come from having more interdependency has advanced. And you couple all that with return profiles becoming smaller and smaller for more traditional investments, and you get a huge market segment of folks that are interested in looking at investment projects that are in the low teens to mid-teen returns unlevered, which is hard to find in traditional projects these days. So you're seeing things like waste to value, gasification of waste streams into syngas, renewable hydrogen production. We're seeing a huge growth in animal feed, for example, which is a massive sector for emissions control, right? How do we create sustainable agriculture? So we're working on some really cool projects, for example, where we take waste streams from dairy farms and we actually produce black soldier fly larvae as feed for Tyson and Cargill and a lot of the big animal producers. It's 100% circular economy. So you're actually creating food for your animals from a waste stream that's coming from a different animal, and it's all organic and it's natural, and it's an incredible market. And we're seeing lots of those types of things. And what I was saying earlier was there is zero question in my mind that it is the constraint on the number of investable projects that's limiting the investment flow into these markets. It's not available capital. It's not interest in that capital being deployed. It's projects that are credit worthy and have the right makings to be investable and underwritable. And where the cities and where Katie and Zach and Doug and Laura and Nexus, for example, can work together and do is in the implementation side is what do the cities need to do to provide the level of creditworthiness and underwriting capabilities to the Blackstones and Riverstones and GIPs and the big infrastructure funds that quite frankly have so much money to move the needle. What do they need in order to get comfortable to invest those dollars of capital into making sure that these climate goals that these cities have are achievable, and not just to, I think it was Katie's point, is 2 years from now, lots of conversation has been had, but the actual physical on the ground work hasn't been accomplished to the liking to meet those goals. And private-public partnerships is inevitably going to be a big piece that allows that to happen. But for private-public partnerships to work, there still has to be a financial return that's viable. And for a financial return to be viable, it needs to have good partners that stand behind the commitment, whether that's the city's committing to 10-year agreements to supply municipal solid waste streams and to stand behind, you're going to get all of our waste, or it's microgrids and we're going to stand behind making sure that microgrids have the right types of incentive programs to make sure that there's a longevity aspect to this. Things like manufacturing, right? Manufacturing is a big component of emissions, right? Giving the right incentives or giving the right long-term confidence in the ability to go greener on manufacturing and distribution warehouses and facilities. Those types of things are where the cities can really step up. And where we see a lot of projects just not quite make it to the finish line because there's not creditworthy counterparties standing behind the agreements for the long term. And so I think overarching theme is plenty of money out there. I think it's just finding the right way to make that money accessible by putting projects in a position where they really give the investors confidence that there's strong counterparties standing behind the key agreements, and the cities can play a major role in doing that.
Okay, so there's plenty of money out there. That's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is every time we eat a pork chop, we're indirectly eating black soldier fly larva, which is a very, very encouraging
I will tell you
thought.
this much. You'd rather be eating that than some of the other alternatives.
Okay, so while I have you, take me through the recipe, if you will. How does this work? So let's say it's a municipal waste facility and they have biogas or something like that, and they want someone to come in and help them capture that and generate it, or some kind of a project. Does the developer come to you and say, or are you the developer in this case, like, where do you fit and where are you located? Is it North America or more globally? And then how does a whole project come together? Can you, in just say 2 minutes, outline the aegis and then how that goes from sort of beginning to fruition?
Yeah, so developer, and which is oftentimes, some sort of technology-driven company. So I'll actually use a real-life example. Company came to us. They actually have an interesting technology that removes sludge from wastewater treatment facilities cost-effectively and actually turns it into sellable byproducts. A big part of these climate plans is how do we improve our wastewater treatment efforts and remove some of the nasty byproducts. We did due diligence on their product. We approached a lot of these municipalities with them because we have great relationships with many of them around the country, to your point, mostly in North America, but we do work in Western Europe as well. And then the next question is, how do we get capital to really progress it, right? You've got a lot of engineering and design. You've got to have lawyers engaged in agreement negotiations and those things. And there are many of the funds out there, the Blackstones, the big funds, they don't have the opportunity or the time to spend on those smaller early stage investments. So there are development capital funds. Nexus actually has its own that's in process of being launched. There's folks like Leeline Capital, Macquarie has one. There's lots of folks who allow you to access that first $2 or $3 million to get a project to a point where the big infrastructure funds can come in. So they engage us to essentially work with Katie and Zach and Doug and Laura and get introduced to the right players at the municipality level to come in. And we were able to go in a facility in New York, implement this technology, and happy to say that we were removing all the sludge and creating biochar, which is an agricultural product used as a soil amendment. And so not only are we benefiting the municipality, but the company that invested is actually making a byproduct that's making a good return. So it's kind of the definition of the circular economy. So we have a lot of companies come to us in that regard and then use our relationships with these folks to kind of get the capital that's needed for that first few $1 million and get these projects really moving forward that benefits everybody.
Thanks. And I promise the four of you I'm going to get back to in a second. But Ben, one more question. So once you've figured out like the intellectual and financial frontier for one of these particular projects, can you then lather, rinse, repeat it? Like you've learned all this stuff, you know how to finance it, you understand the technology. Can you then turn around from Dallas and go, hey, Houston, have I got a product for you or a project for you? And then San Antonio and so on. I mean, can you create efficiencies around that learning process over time so that it just gets better and better and better? And then you stay in certain verticals as a consequence? Absolutely.
There's no question about it. In fact, that is the premise for what excites the investment community. They want what the portfolio growth plays. They want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. It doesn't even make a dent if they don't. So for them to spend $50 million on a project is not interesting. For them to spend $50 million 10 times over and over and over again and repeat those projects is absolutely what inspires them. And so, we're doing that right now. Anaerobic digestion is a great example. There's lots of those starting to spread around the country. We went from 250 facilities to 250 facilities under construction right now. So just in 3 years, roughly. And so what that is people putting large facilities on dairy farms and hog waste farms and things like that, and taking all that waste stream, producing renewable natural gas, selling it into Chevron and BP, and they're all buyers of these products. And it's a rinse, wash, repeat. It's the same thing over and over and over and over again. And it's once you kind of get that continuity, you can just kind of accelerate. And I think you're starting to see the early days in a lot of these verticals of the clear winners are starting to surface, and you're going to start seeing, I think, wide adoption once you kind of understand who are the 2 or 3 winners in each vertical.
Okay, so then the last question of my emerging thesis statement. Would there potentially be opportunities where we've got 4 of the largest cities in Texas, if they all realized they had similar projects in common? Could that accelerate and ignite the interest of investor where they would be perhaps less interested if just one party was involved?
Absolutely. I mean, the wastewater treatment's a great example. If all 4 cities came together and said, we want to improve the efficiency of our wastewater treatment plants, not only potentially upgrade them, but we want to remove sludge, we want to remove the waste and convert, and you could get an investor to come in and say, well, all 4 cities now stand behind this. This technology company has proven that they can do this. It's an absolute no-brainer that would add a significant fuel to getting things done faster.
Excellent. So we can talk afterwards about my 1% if this all comes together offline. So, all right. So we got these projects. Most of you are in the early days of your climate action plan. And we talked last time about, first of all, the challenge of reaching out to various sectors in your cities and engaging them and the different methods. So I think, in fact, in the conversation, we're saying, yeah, some folks, the converted are already the converted. but there's this challenge of getting out there in different ways with digital media and so on. What are the best ways to communicate with the multiple parties in your cities? Lara, I just want to keep on being reminded that you're out there even though I can't see your face. So this one's going to go to you first. How do you broaden as much as possible your communications reach across the greater Houston area so people are aware of what you're doing and what the opportunities are for folks to interact with you? How does that best work?
So I think communication is one of the biggest challenges we have to reducing emissions, which may not seem like a direct connection, but in a city the size of Houston, 2.4 million people, plus the greater Houston area, it's really hard to let anyone know what the city is doing on any given thing at any given time, much less climate. And then throwing COVID on top of that, a lot of our traditional communication methods, the town halls, the going out to meetings, presenting to community groups, school groups, industry groups, we can't do that quite the same. It is great that we can have virtual meetings like this, but as you can see today, sometimes with technology fails. And so we're really kind of trying to look at our communication channels and figure out how can we keep growing our audience. Houston Climate Week was a great example of how we did a lot of promotion to try and let people know we were having an event, give them lots of opportunities to tune in and watch content after the fact. But we also really wanted to bring in as many community members as possible, because you may not know the sustainability office, but you might know the 30 people we had who were speakers, or you might know their organizations. So we are making a concerted effort to partner with as many organizations as possible in hopes that we can exponentially expand our network by working through those networks. And a network within the city that is a really neat program that we have here is called Complete Communities. And instead of being kind of an issue focus, it's really focused on 10 communities that are historically underserved and vulnerable populations. And instead of it being the city telling them, like pushing information, which happens a lot, the Complete Communities program is really focused on the community and finding out what they need, what they want, what they think is missing in their community. And then that information comes back to the city, and we see how the climate action plan or the resilience strategy or different operations that we have going on can try and address those needs. So it's definitely still a work in progress and a challenge. But also we have an open door. We have an invitation to anyone listening out there that wants to learn more about the Climate Action Plan. Like, please take us up on the offer. We will do whatever we can to meet with your group and find out how we can work together.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to moderate the panel that Lara's team had on Sunnyside, which is a large community and a large solar array that's being developed within Houston with a community solar component on a former landfill and a highly historically disadvantaged black neighborhood. And the conversation highlighted the level of trust that Lara and her team had to build among people that have been historically maltreated over centuries in some instances, and the partnerships they've been working to develop. Now, Doug, I remember in our conversation, and Paula Gould-Williams said the same thing to me, that San Antonio is one of the largest cities with a low-income population, and there are particular challenges around that. What sorts of partners do you reach out to there, and what constitutes an effective partnership? I know we're still in the early innings of this game, but what does that look like to you where you think, okay, this one actually might work because we got the communications going? And how does that evolve over time, and what do you look for, and what are the things you bring to that?
Yeah, and I think Lara sort of hit the nail on the head probably for all of us regarding engagement across our organizations. How do you do it when you can't meet in person? We start, we're all relying on web-based solutions, and you couple that with the digital divide, there's some major challenges. So I guess simply, I don't have the easy answer for that at this point in time. I think one of the things that we've done that we're really looking forward to is we finally found a couple local meteorologists who have started, at least talking about climate a little bit. So we're hoping to foster some relationships with them. I know you just go up I-35, and I know in Austin, there's meteorologists talking about climate. So again, how do you start normalizing the conversation across the community where there's trusted messengers that people tune into every day who are at least saying, hey, boy, it's hot today, but it's because of this. So that's one big thing that we're really looking forward to. The other thing is City Council just approved the slate of advisory committee members for our climate plan. There's two. One's a technical and community committee that's got representatives from business to neighborhoods to environmental organizations. And then there's a climate equity group that's basically just grassroots organizations that are focused predominantly on the voices and the needs of our most vulnerable populations. We're going to rely on them to help get the word out and make the connections. I think as Laura had mentioned, the city isn't necessarily the best one to do that. When we talk about decades and years of disenfranchisement, of racism, there's a big trust issue, and it's not enough for the Office of Sustainability to say, hey, we want to talk to you about environmental justice and climate justice when the community's not there yet to talk to us. So it really is about building relationships, building trust, and showing good faith in actually responding to those communities' needs. It's not enough to sit down, talk, listen, and then ignore it. And so I think that's sort of the point where we are as an organization, and not just around climate, just about affordable housing, transportation. We're talking about equity, but the issue is city government going to respond and start making the changes in response to those community needs?
Yeah, would it be fair to say there was a lot of justifiable skepticism?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for going on 16 years, and we have small wins. We can deliver to the communities, but we aren't hitting the structural issues that exist within government that are continuing the inequities in our community. So I think that's the key. We can put a Band-Aid on things, or we can have conversations around how we need to sort of change how we make decisions and how we fund things.
And Zach, you're nodding. So would it be fair also to say that in many cases, those folks can give you a clear indication of what those real needs are on the ground, and you would have the capability to find out from your office? Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah. I mean, like in our climate planning process this time, we spent a lot of time trying to get that real on the ground feedback. And a thing that we tried is we reimbursed people for their time. So we had stipends that we paid individuals, not large amounts of money, but just like enough money that it made it worth people's time, so they didn't feel like they were coming to the table, wasting their own time and energy, and then working to be listened to. The thing I was not about a minute ago was that in one of our advisor group meetings, there was distinctly a meeting where some of the community members that were on this group said, we don't have any confidence that anything that we're putting in this plan is going to actually get implemented. And they're like, we're being honest about that. And we're going to keep trying, and we're here to build trust with you, and we think that you're going to give it another shot. But it was very clear that they had been burned before and didn't have confidence that we were going to follow up. To a couple of the other things Doug was saying, it's very clear, and some of our own communication staff at the city have said this, is that if you really want to reach everyone in the community with a message, the city isn't the best messenger to do that. As we've heard feedback on our climate plan, when you pair an issue like climate that's gotten so politicized nationally, and then you pair it with government, which a lot of people right now are down on government and not supportive of government. you get a significant portion of the population that's just like, hi, I'm Zach. I work for the government on climate change. There's a good portion of the community that like, A, is never going to like receive that message from me. And even if they did receive it, they don't want to hear it and aren't going to like do anything about it. So like, we've got to connect with people through nonprofits and through businesses and through like the news, the weather people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be coming from all the angles.
Yeah.
And like, I can't be responsible for all this communication.
I can just see you going trick-or-treating with a bag. I'm Zach. I work for the city. I work for climate change. Come home an hour later, there's nothing in there. What about art? Can you use art as a, is that an effective tool?
I mean, at this point, we're trying everything, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, in our communications that we do through social media,
Yeah.
I mean, we're trying to find like unique individuals in the communities, like doing unique things. And a lot of time that ends up being performing arts or graphic arts or music or like things that get people interested and excited about things. Because like, again, Zach from the city comes with a 90-page PDF. You're carving off a good portion of the population that doesn't care about a 90-page PDF.
Yeah. Okay, one last question for you. You brought in these people, or you surveyed a whole bunch of folks. Were there 2 or 3 commonalities, issues that bubble up to the top every time? And if so, what?
Like in our most recent climate plan survey, I mean, the positive comments were like, yes, do more faster. And they were very supportive of the equity component to our work because they were like, look, we've been waiting for this for a long time. We're so glad that the city is like finally addressing this and taking, more responsibility. On the negative side, I mean, a lot of the comments were just anti-government.
Yeah.
We're just like, government shouldn't be doing this. Government shouldn't even like be in this space. And, some sort of climate denial. But even there were comments where people were seemingly like in support of climate change and in support of action. But then when it came to like, well, is this going to cost money and this is going to take action and take like people to do things? Then all of a sudden it was like, well, maybe climate change is happening, but I'm not going to pay for that. And I don't know who you expect to pay for that. So those were kind of some buckets of comments.
Well, it's interesting to have a realistic appraisal of the challenges. Let's stick with the concept of capacity and coalition building. Back when I was young, which was a long time ago, say 40 years or so, I worked in Africa around capacity building with nonprofits over there. And there were cultural issues, but those exist here as well in some instances. But then there were just the simple challenges of, okay, we have partners out there, but some of them aren't necessarily, they may be great at communications, but they might not be good at bookkeeping. And if they've got grants that they're, supposed to implement things, like what are the, we talked about this a little bit before, this capacity and coalition building. What are the skill sets that most need to be buttressed among the partners that you are working with? And I know this is a broad spectrum, but Doug, I'm going to ask the rest of the question so you can have a little bit of time to think while I'm asking it. So you're dealing with all these potential partners out there that help magnify some of the capabilities you're trying to accomplish. What sorts of skill sets might be improved in some instances, whether it's just technical stuff, spreadsheets and that sort of thing, or finance and accounting, or, do you see certain things where maybe that's where some of the money should go, is in the capacity building? What's the conversation around that look like?
Oh, that one's for me, huh?
Yep.
That's a really tough question, because I think at the core, I think of some of the challenges that we've faced during the plan development and now, heading into implementation. It's as Zach had mentioned, it's politicized, and it's what is an individual or what is a group's agenda. Everybody has an agenda, and so we as government and in our office, we have a tough job where there's a really diverse community with people who are on all sides of this issue, and yet the clock's ticking and we need to move this stuff forward as quickly as possible. So, how do we engage with community members and get them to be as effective with their time? And so, I think an example is, I think there's, in our community in San Antonio, I think there's room for better organizing around climate issues. I think we have advocates there. We've got environmental advocates, social justice advocates. There's even people in the business community who we believe are supportive. But there isn't an organized approach where that message is being permeated throughout the community. I think what's being heard from these different groups is being perceived as very extreme, either on one side or the other. And so I think it's very easy for city leaders and general community members to discount this. I think there needs to be more political understanding about how you run a grassroots campaign. How do you start bringing the bulk of the community that would be on board with this, like as Zach had mentioned, but when they start thinking about how it impacts them, are willing to say we're out. So I think definitely there's an opportunity for increasing skills around communications and building coalitions and advocacy from the community-wide level, where it's not just the city trying to do that. So I don't know if that's a good answer to the question. Uh-oh.
I think Peter froze.
He's frozen. I stumped him. So while
maybe
we're
you went to eat some black soldier flies.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to take that? Because that was a really tough question. I mean, what are those needs in the community related to that?
So I had.
Oh,
Go ahead, Laura.
I was going to say that one of the things that we have been seeing lately is a lot of interest from community members and from companies saying, I want to get involved. What can I do? But they don't know what. And then we have to kind of internally look at their operations or what do they do. And in Houston, it kind of falls under two categories. One is, we can just look at your physical operations, your buildings, your transportation, and things like that. But then also, what does your industry do? And if you're in the energy sector, how can you decarbonize? And so the good news is there's a lot of movement in the energy industry here of trying to internally build some capacity so that they can work together, because it's hard for the city and for our office to kind of parachute into another company's operations and try to tell them what to do, and they don't want us to tell them what to do. But there seems to be a gap between I want to do something, but then knowing actually how to do that on your own.
Thanks. I disappeared for a minute, so thank you for picking up the cudgel there, Laura. What about, like, for example, Houston Ship Channel has huge industries out there. Are conversations taking place at that level, for example, to single out a certain area, or is that outside of the Houston area?
So the ship channel is always a hot topic of discussion. Ports are notorious for having all kinds of really high emissions, and they're also usually, or at least here in Houston, there's some very vulnerable frontline communities that live next to the ports and are impacted, even though the Port of Houston is not technically within the city boundaries. Air quality doesn't care about city limits, and that is something that we're always working on. It's tricky because it crosses many different jurisdictions, but that's a really good example of there's lots of potential technologies, there's lots of things that can be piloted, but there are only a couple examples on the planet of where it's been implemented. And so how do you make that kind of massive upgrade and transition from technologies when they've been doing the same thing for a very long time, right? So you've got to move from the discussion phase to the actual implementation phase, and that's tricky.
Yeah, it is, for sure. Just as a matter of note, last week, Port of Rotterdam announced they launched a microgrid with a 48-hour lead time blockchain-enabled trading platform where they've reduced electricity costs by 11% and increased the amount of renewables in the system by 14% just in the last 2 months. So maybe an interesting model to look at since you have so much free time on your plate. But nonetheless, and then Long Beach, I think, is doing some cool stuff as well in their ports. And then you've got, for example, in Houston as well, the whole EV initiative, right, with
Evolve Houston?
Yeah, go with Evolve Houston.
Okay. Absolutely. So, I mean, similar to what San Antonio, I think, was talking about, that transportation is a huge source of emissions in Houston, and it makes sense because we are such a car city. We are a huge geographic city, but we also have major transportation thoroughfares that go right in the middle. So everyone who's driving from Florida to California is coming through Houston at some point in time. And so electric vehicles are a big opportunity. And the city recognized that in our climate action plan. Internally, we want to electrify our light-duty non-emergency fleet, which is several thousand vehicles. But we recognize that we don't have the internal capacity to work with all of the private fleet, all of the commercial
you send out
fleet. And so we created Evolve Houston as a public-private partnership. And we brought in some really innovative outside-the-box partners, Shell and NRG and Centerpoint and the University of Houston, as well as the City of Houston. So those are a lot of big energy companies, but they're all invested in vehicle electrification with the idea that their names bring clout in the City of Houston. They have their own networks and partners within the business community, and that if they can stand up and say they believe in electric vehicles, as does the city, they can help make some waves within their part of our community.
So those larger main players could have a really powerful catalytic effect. Are there other cities of you are having similar conversations with the private sector, and any particular initiatives that look like they might bring some fruit? Zach, for example, with Tesla, is anything, I know they're located near the airport. That's huge. Folks are excited. But are there things emerging in that space as well?
So I've not heard anything specific to Tesla.
Uh-huh.
In Austin, I mean, Austin Energy, again, has a lot of the control here. They actually got passed there was an ordinance change in the last year or so, though, that for the longest time, it was just all public charging infrastructure was owned by Austin Energy. And they actually got the ordinance changed so third-party companies could set up charging station infrastructure and resell Austin Energy's power through their own public charging network. Locally, there's an organization called TechCetra, which is kind of Austin-based folks, but is just trying to move this whole initiative forward with coordination with the private sector, with kind of political advocacy, trying to kind of move on all fronts. Again, realizing that the city can't do all of this itself.
Thanks. Ben, has your company been dragged into EV and infrastructure and that sort of thing yet? Have conversations come into your space around transportation in particular?
Yeah, we've started working more in, especially with the battery storage angle. But we've worked on some of the battery projects, which I can't talk too much about because we're pretty tight-lipped on the non-disclosure agreements. But yeah, we've started working more and more on some of that. Microgrids, deregulation of certain types of, I'm actually working with a developer right now, which is kind of interesting, that's doing property, like housing development communities that are basically plug and play for all intents and purposes. They come pre-designed, modularly fabricated over in Europe, and they basically just develop the land and have a pre-design. They plug down, has its own microgrid, its own solar, its own anaerobic digestion, wastewater treatment processing underground. It's actually quite clever. So we're starting to see more and more of that stuff. I think one of the questions I saw pop up was, what's going to move the needle, right? So particularly for Nexus, we are an infrastructure heavy background team. So, I worked for a large engineering company, my colleagues, a lot of the same. So we tend to spend projects. I think one of the questions was what scale, projects that we work on tend to be somewhere $20-30 million on the low end, up to, several $billion. And so when you look at some of the impacts these projects are making, they're quite significant. When you start looking at things like renewable hydrogen production, these projects get north of $1 billion. Renewable biodiesel, or biodiesel or biojet fuel, and some of these things, they're quite sizable, and they do make a pretty meaningful impact. I think one of the things that seems to be a predominant theme here in this discussion is how do you get the message out and inspire people to want to be on this journey, and that is a significant challenge, and we even face the same challenge. And I know you're very aware of this, Peter, but we launched a podcast, for example. We wanted to do our part. How do we not just do these projects, but how do we share a message of what people are doing? How do people understand? I mean, I think everybody would agree that, unfortunately, the news media, just broadly, whatever side of the fence you're on, is relatively biased toward negative news. We have a natural inclination as human beings to just have an affinity. It's the same reason we stare at a car wreck when we drive by it. But there are so many positive things happening. They're just not getting the voice. They're not getting the attention they deserve. And so I know you do a lot of that, Peter. You have your book you're writing. We have a podcast that I'll shamelessly plug called Bigger Than Us that Peter's been on there a couple of times. It's incredible. Raj Daniels is the host, and we highlight unbelievable technologies.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Lara's been on it too.
I think Barr might have been on as well, but it's an incredible story of showcasing, because I think the more we can showcase the wins that we have as cities, as individuals, as I was on LinkedIn the other day eating high protein crickets to showcase one of our clients out of Austin. So Zach might appreciate that. They were backed on. They were backed by Mark Cuban on Shark Tank. They make high protein food bars, but they also make it for the industrial level for animal proteins. But they make it same people that make black soldier flies. They make cricket protein and powders and bars and things of that nature out of Austin. So I was on there when we were talking earlier about how do you get people interested. It's weird things like that get people interested. I had an unbelievable, overwhelming reaction to people wanting to see me eat cricket, because they're just like, what does it taste like? How does it feel? So the more we bring in the amazing things that these people are doing that are sustainable, but so interesting and fascinating, and we can tell these stories, I think the impact, the way we can see these things accelerate.
Yeah, the narrative really is critical, is it not? I mean, we kind of, the narrative ends up defining who we are and what we end up doing sometimes, and whether or not we're successful at it. And so I do think finding all these different ways to excite the imagination is a real challenge for all of us in the sustainable community, whether it's cities or other places, which is why I'm so looking forward to seeing a couple of years down the road, when all of you have had a chance to get more traction in the space and just see what emerges in those ecosystems.
And I don't think it's
yeah.
Oh, sorry, but I was going to say, like, one of the other aspects, and Katie probably knows this, and I imagine everybody in the state of Texas knows this by now, but like, you look at what EarthX is doing, right? Who would have guessed that Dallas, of all cities in the United States, would be leading the forefront of some of the biggest climate change conventions and different sustainability conventions in the world, quite frankly. And you look at what these folks are doing, and you look at the fact that they were adapt to go virtual, and they had over, when I talked to Trammell, I think he was on our podcast, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people all over the world attended these virtual summits. They're launching their own media news channel now. So it's there. It just needs the support of all the cities, all the folks like us, everybody who's on this webinar to endorse, share, and be involved, because the story is overwhelmingly positive when you look for the positives.
Yeah, he's launching Earth TV. I just talked to him like 2 weeks ago, coincidentally.
Yeah, he launched a few weeks ago.
Yeah, we're talking some of the numbers are staggering. Tens of trillions of dollars of investment required between now and 2050 to get us there. So the numbers of stories and the narrative that can emerge around that strikes me as potentially really compelling, but we don't have that many storytellers in the industry. In fact, I think we're rather poor at that as an industry overall. The average person sees a Tesla driving down the road. They don't know what it's emblematic of, or seeing solar panels on a roof. That they don't know how they fit into that. I have neighbors and so on who don't even understand what I do, and they're friends of mine. But talking about that story and accountability and transparency, it struck me when we were on the prep call, and I think, Zach, you might have brought it up, but not to put you on the hot seat, but talking about how you continue to engage with city council and with other people who are involved in this, in the sense that they may set the directives, but then you want to be able to communicate back to all the stakeholders, if you will, and be held accountable, if it will, and have some transparency. What's the frustration or the opportunity around that? And I don't mean to single you out, but I think you raised the issue around some of the challenges of keeping folks' imagination inspired and just making sure that they were holding you accountable for what you're trying to accomplish. Can we talk a little bit about, among the four of you, what the conversation is like within City Hall and how you continue to educate the people who are ostensibly driving some of these conversations at the high level? Zach, insights on that?
Yeah. It's a challenge because at City Hall, there are always a million fires, right? And
Right.
like every fire always seems bigger, right?
Yep.
And even though, our city council will pass a climate emergency resolution, and like for the moment, it feels like, oh, wow, this is it. Like they're really focused on this. Then months go by and like climate change is not brought up at a city council meeting, and like there's a ton of other fires, and it sort of like falls to the wayside. I think part of the challenge with conversations on this is that the topic is so broad, right? You want to talk. We could spend hours on energy. You could spend hours on transportation. You could spend hours on waste. Like, there's so many topics, and it's hard for everyone to know all this stuff, right? And then a lot of times we get sort of interest groups in the community that are really dialed in on one angle, but not all the angles. And then there's so many different levels of conversation of like, I'm just interested, all the way up to like, I know all the details. And it makes this whole thing like challenging to deal with, I think, in the setting like a city council meeting. Because not everyone has the same information. Not everyone's on the same page. It's hard for everybody to be like up to speed on all the topics. And so, yeah, it's just, I would imagine that this happens in other cities too, that it's just an ongoing battle to like keep everybody up to speed, and keep the conversation sort of elevated and moving and like on the radar when there's fatigue and there's, and it's complicated. So I don't know. That's kind of a jumbled mess of an answer, but like it's really tough.
It's a marathon. Yeah.
Yeah,
Doug, you're nodding.
COVID fatigue.
Yeah.
Climate fatigue. Climate fatigue has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah. Doug, you were nodding. You have any thoughts to add on that?
Yeah, Zach, I feel for you. I think what we're going to be trying. I think one of the challenges that we have, and I think somebody might have alluded to it before, is this can't just be an office of sustainability thing. We're a small, teeny office with a small budget, and But when you step back and you look at the organization, it's $1 billion plus organization. So we're going to be trying two things. I'll let everybody know how it goes, but we're going to be kicking off a comprehensive climate training program from the executives on down to the frontline workers, just sort of try to understand what is this? What is, because I told all the executives on a call last week, if I were to call on any of you, I guarantee you couldn't tell me what this plan was. So, one, what is this? And then the second thing is it's going to lead to creating departmental consistency plans. So we went through the entire plan and just created an individual document for each department that says, look, this is what you quote unquote own. And that should be the basis for developing a specific climate plan for that department. And it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a lot of work. But until the organization as a whole is driving in the same direction, every presentation that's that any department gives to council should have a climate component. What we are doing, now is consistent with the climate objectives in this way, and council has to expect that and ask for it. Because again, getting back to that, if there's no accountability, this is going to fall to the bottom of the list.
Yeah, Katie, you're nodding. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything Zach and Doug have said, I 100% agree with it. Climate needs to be part of every conversation. And the double-edged sword there, right, is the fatigue that we're talking about. And one of the things that came to mind when we were talking earlier about what skill sets do some of these groups need is it gets too big. And it came to mind again when you're talking about billions of dollars in investment to curb climate change, right? That's a huge number. And so it gets to the point where individuals and even organizations feel overwhelmed and get to the point where, how can I help tackle this thing? It's too big. It's bigger than me. And so narrowing the focus down to what that group or what that individual can do with, as you mentioned, the storytelling is so important. And part of that story is including that, going back up and including that environmental or climate lens in everything that we do. At the City of Dallas, we have this wonderful Office of Equity, and part of what came out of that office is everything that is presented or budgeted has an equity component to it. There's an equity analysis tied to it. I think another step might be to do something like that with climate or environment. Everything we do having that environmental or climate lens tied to it. Branding everything with CCAP, tying everything that the city does back to CCAP, because our plan really does touch on everything we do at the city. Everything that we do in our day-to-day lives, everything that's in city programs somehow is linked back to climate. And so using that lens and using that branding, I think, is going to really further the conversation and make sure that we're consistent across the board with how we approach it.
Thank you. And Laura, certainly with your Climate Action Week, that was a deliberate attempt to foster that conversation and kick off that narrative. What are the next steps in Houston around that communications effort?
Well, so, hot off the presses, it literally happened while we were on this webinar. City Council approved a resolution supporting the Climate Action Plan and actually approved an ordinance institutionalizing the Climate Action Plan here in Houston, which is right in line with what you heard the other cities say about that accountability and transparency. One of the questions that I get asked pretty frequently is, well, it's great that you're working on this now, but what guarantee do I have that it's going to be, you're still going to be working on this, the city's still going to be working on this, the next mayor, 2 mayors from now. And so putting that climate, that sustainability responsibility into the ordinance, codifying it, saying the city is going to do this, we're going to keep doing this, we're going to have an open and transparent and equitable community dialogue and stakeholder engagement process it's the next first step, and it's an important first step, because that's kind of saying we are all in on this, that it is part of what we do. As Katie said, it's part of what every part of the city has to do, and that's going to take some time to really explain to all of the departments what that means. We're already working on that, but we have a great network of departmental resilience officers, and then the ordinance that just passed today just kind of says all of the departments have to take part in the Climate Action Plan. That means they have to help create it and provide feedback, but also help implement it. So that is big for Houston. It's not often that City Council officially opines on climate. So,
you know, congratulations, Laura. I hope that you and your team stop and take a moment and appreciate the wins, because you're going to have enough challenges in the years to come that when you do notch one, I hope you take time to celebrate that. That's fantastic. Okay, so if I were a really bad lawyer, I would ask an open-ended question to which I do not know the answer. And I'm going to do that before we open this up to Q&A from the audience, because we're about coming down to the half-hour left mark. What questions have I not asked you that I should have, so that this is the fulsome conversation we were trying to achieve here? Zach, anything I haven't raised that's really germane to the conversation that you're like, wow, he just totally missed the ball on that one? Please feel free to put me on the spot.
No, I don't think so.
All right, Doug?
I mean, the elephant in the room is what are we doing if we can't tackle climate change? You know, it's where, you know, we're all drastically working to try to accelerate, you know, reductions as much as possible. What are you doing on that, you know, as far as that adaptation side, you know, to prepare?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I moderated an MIT panel where the whole thing, you know, I'm in Boston and we're figuring we're going to lose the Back Bay, you know, by the year 2100 with sea level rise at 3 to 4 feet. And the utilities are already talking about moving the infrastructure and trying to determine the balance between adaptation and you know, trying to stop this thing from happening, where one's global and the other one's really local. And it's going to be, I think that conversation is going to get pronounced as we move forward in time, because it's going to have to be. So thank you for raising it. It's a super big challenge. Katie, anything that I should have asked you that, or the team, that you'd like to, you know, raise as a topic?
Well, Doug's question is going to keep me up at night. I think we've covered all the big topics.
Laura?
my only thing I already asked and I always ask is just for everyone to find a way to get involved. We have working groups here in Houston that we are looking for everyone to participate in. So I'm sure all of the cities have ways as well.
Great, thank you. Well, now I'm going to try and see if I can look at these questions. Okay, here we go. So I'm trying to see if I can just pull the whole thing down without. So one, it was mentioned billions of dollars are needed for climate action. Have any of your sustainability offices had a conversation with city leadership? Oh, requesting them to stop giving massive tax breaks to companies moving to your city. This is tricky. Texas loves tax breaks and loves to be a state of innovation, economic opportunity. If they do come in, I mean, obviously you want the economic development, you want the jobs and that sort of thing. But are there ways to have them come in and perhaps agree to or be more engaged in the climate conversation than otherwise would be the case? How do you think about, you know, the new neighbors coming in, bringing the economic development? I know when Tesla was talking about what they're going to do, they have an eco park they're surrounding it, but not everybody's doing that. What does that conversation look like with new industries locating in your respective municipalities at this point? Anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. And we started this conversation with our economic development department probably a year or so ago. But again, it's that idea of aligning the work that they're doing with the broader climate objectives. You know, when there should be something tied to our incentive packages that companies are getting, some sort of commitment, some sort of something that's going to help move the needle on our climate objectives. If they're getting an incentive and the jobs are great and definitely something that we want, but you know, if we're going to be really coordinated, there should be an expectation that that company or whoever is making some sort of commitment to help us reach our reduction or adaptation goals.
Thank you. then what are the single largest project that each participant wants to highlight? I want to understand scale and cost. That is, we will mitigate X million tons of CO2 at a cost of dollars Y, or we have X, Y, Z process that can sequester a little bit of CO2, but is cost neutral. Are we at the point now where we have specific projects, or is it still early in the stage because most of you released the plans within, say, the last year, that it's hard to point something at this point? Zach, you are all probably the furthest along. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Austin, the biggest single projects are Austin Energy's investments in renewable energy, which are millions of dollars and are cost effective, for ratepayers. I mean, that's probably the best example.
Great, thank you. Let's see. All right, so here's a comment. This won't happen if business and people do business as usual. There has to be a law enforceable by penalty to use climate-friendly products, especially when superior and less expensive. There's some sensitivities around that issue, right? I mean, we see this in the election. We see it around laws telling people what to do, et cetera. What's the thought on that balance between making something compulsory versus making it voluntary? Anyone have any, and I don't want you to say anything that's going to get you in political trouble. Does anyone feel comfortable opining on sort of what that balance might be?
I think there's an important thing that needs to be taken into consideration when you talk about things like that is the equity component. It's people who have the time and means to do the green thing, so to speak, to purchase a Tesla, to buy organic, to put solar panels on their home. They're lucky, right? They may not be representative of everybody. So when we're talking about making compulsory requirements and changing the law and the ordinance, you have to really take that into consideration. So that's a very nuanced conversation, but I wanted to point at least that part of it out.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah. Go ahead.
And I would also say that it also depends what the state legislature looks like. I think there've definitely been cases where there's been preemption. Where cities have tried to enact code changes that basically are thrown out. They're ruled unconstitutional. So I think a lot of this conversation around how do we tackle climate requires state and largely federal support. There's only so much that cities can do when you start talking about a massive transformation of our entire society.
Yeah, right. And even if you decarbonize and nobody else did, it goes without saying, right? In fact, there was a question here. Someone said, state of California has a successful emissions reduction plan at the state level, specifically low carbon fuel standards, govern a set of laws that permit issuance of incentive credits to transportation industry's players that show low carbon fuel pathways. What would it take for the state of Texas to take the reins and establish similar low carbon standards? Are the cities engaged with the legislatures or with the Texas Leg? And are there certain representatives that are really interested in the stuff that reach out to you and want to find out what you're doing? What does it look like on the ground? Anybody have a comment on that?
I mean, all of our cities have, intergovernmental relations departments, and in those departments, come up with the legislative agenda of the city, and they push those things and advocate for those things, and they're doing that work. Just the conditions in the state of Texas, just in the last, however many years, have just been, it sort of hasn't mattered how much you're trying and working. The state has been preempting, city activity.
Yeah. Okay. So that's where we stand now.
And what I would say is we have, legislators who do reach out on a regular basis, just seeing how we're doing with the plan and if there's anything they can do. I think as Zach, alluded to, I think a lot of times, with the legislature, our government relations folks are just basically keeping us abreast of what's going on, and we're playing defense. What's being proposed that's going to be completely contradictory to what we're trying to accomplish locally, and what do we do?
That must be frustrating.
The low carbon fuel standard and the renewable fuel standard programs are something that I personally and our company spends endless amounts of times on. We've done dozens and dozens of projects that send, RNG and things of that nature into California. And what I can tell you is, we do a lot of advisory work in the expansion of those programs. So there are 4 more states that are actually launching those programs right now in the process of, including Washington State, Oregon, and New York. Florida, believe it or not, is even contemplating one, and they will actually be putting their first renewable natural gas project that actually keeps the gas within the city, within the state online here in the next 6 months. So these programs are starting to pick up steam. And as cheesy as this sounds, a lot of this comes down to you have to vote for the leaders, because I think it's nearly impossible for Katie, Zach, Doug, and Laura to be successful if they don't have state and federal support. I mean, that's just the harsh reality of this environment. We have to have a unified plan. And the only way we're going to do that is if we have a unified front. And it comes down to people voicing their ability to have that unified front. And that comes down to voting, and that comes down to elected officials. That comes down to making sure the right people are in the right places.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. Laura, there's a question for you. Do you face any obstacles from fossil fuel lobbyists in progressing your climate action plan in Houston? You mentioned before it is the energy capital of the world. Is there obvious pushback, or are most people sort of either quiet about it or trying to figure out, how to make money in this transition?
It's been a progression, definitely. When we started, there were a lot of raised eyebrows and questions and hesitancy to even meet with us or talk about climate. When we first started, we had a working group that was called Decarbonization, that looked at decarbonization of the energy sector. And feedback from the energy companies was loud and clear that using the word decarbonization was too strong. And so we changed it to energy transition. That was more palatable. And that's a semantic issue to me, because the actions and the goals and the strategies didn't change, right? But it was just kind of a point in time where the industry was, and that has changed. And they have moved forward, and now I think I talked about it a little bit before, that every day more and more fossil fuel companies are committing to decarbonization, right? So that word that they were not comfortable with, now they're taking on themselves. Does that mean every single company is 100% on board? Absolutely not. It's within the energy industry, within the fossil fuel industry, there are very large international, multinational companies, and then there are small, right, like mom and pop oil and gas companies. And it's a spectrum, and each company is impacted differently. We haven't seen that we did so much stakeholder engagement with the energy industry to make sure everyone knew what we were doing and what it meant, to answer the questions and to explain what a city can do, what a climate action plan is, that a city doesn't have the ability to, we had all kinds of things like, does this mean you're going to ban gasoline in Houston? And does this mean you're going to shut down the refineries outside of Houston, right? And the city just, from a very legal, regulatory perspective, doesn't have the ability to do that. And by answering some of the questions and say we're really focusing on emissions reduction over time, that it's not a light switch, that it's a transition and it's going to be really hard, what happened was people and companies became much more comfortable with it. Doesn't mean they agree, but we didn't see a mass campaign trying to oppose the climate action plan, which I think would have happened in Houston if we had done this previously, right? Like years ago. And I'm cautiously optimistic, right, that every day more and more companies are getting on board, that it's not going to become easier, but we're going to get more stakeholders, we're going to get more support.
That's the challenge. It's like running on ice. You can only turn so fast at any given moment in time, unfortunately. Somebody had a comment here that said Zach's observation on the breadth of the challenge just calls up the need for rational federal policy. We should start every climate change conversation with a disclaimer. We need a federal price on emissions so the marketplace stops working against us. Now, you all are an Electric Reliability Council of Texas, so this doesn't matter to you because the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission doesn't have jurisdiction. But just last week, the FERC issued a policy proposition that said, we do believe we have the ability to regulate the incorporation of carbon prices into wholesale markets. So for the rest of the competitive markets in the United States, we might have just seen some very significant progress, and I think that's worth calling out. Another comment, climate needs to be in every project as a priority, not an option. So more of a comment than a question. Have your local governments discussed what you will do if you can't achieve critical targets by 2030? You have gateways along the way, right? Most of you? Yeah, so have you even gotten to the conversation of, well, what if we don't reach these numbers by 2030? Or is that something that's sort of left in the ether for right now? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I'll let you know when we complete our 2019 inventory. Because my gut's telling me is we're going to see, based upon what other cities nationally have been seeing, transportation trending higher. I'd be hard pressed to think that our transportation sector was somehow unique and drastically reducing. So the question is going to be, what do we do? We're off track, and I'd love to hear Zach. What are you guys going to do? That's the challenge. Is and I think that's sort of the key question. When you're not hitting your targets, then what? And that becomes that big policy discussion with the community and the leadership. And I just want to say really briefly, when we talk about low-hanging fruit, that always makes my hair, what's in my hair stand on end, is because there really isn't low-hanging fruit. There's nothing that can be done that's not going to bother somebody, and it's all going to take a shift.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. There's no like legal recourse or penalty or something. I mean, these are the targets that we're setting are essentially like voluntary targets. We're writing into our plan looking out to 2030. If we don't reach the targets through like real local reductions, so if like the inventory doesn't actually come down, I mean, we're writing into the plan that the city would purchase offsets or that we would somehow get reductions from some other place and apply those to our inventory. But I mean, the question of like, would the city council really do that, and how much would that cost, and who would pay for it? I mean, those are all really hard questions that we don't have any of the answers to. So,
yeah, those can be expensive papal indulgences.
And likewise for the CCAP, we plan to review it on every few years based on our inventories and see what we can modify and adapt. And I grew up in South Florida. They're moving people away from the beaches, so at least we don't have to deal with relocating people away from the coast. But I mean, it's our hope is that between technological improvements, behavioral changes, and our own actions at the city, that will meet those targets. But we do plan to update the plan as needed on an ongoing basis.
Your point about Florida is well taken. In fact, Monday, I just saw a screenshot of a king tide advisory. Those are now the tides because of rising sea level, where for a mile stretch of road, people couldn't get to their multi-million-dollar homes because of rising sea levels. Wonder how they're going to vote in this next election. Next question. Several panelists have mentioned the need for clear, consistent creative storytelling, especially through media and influencers like meteorologists. Are any of the cities specifically putting out RFPs for communications? And I'll add to that. are you developing specific communications plans as part that would evolve as part of your efforts?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, we've had a communications plan with our initial climate plan. We did a climate change in Austin video. We actually advertised it on TV. Like, we spent a good amount of money and energy on that. I don't think it like made the emissions like suddenly drop. So there's always this question, we don't have the millions of dollars to like do massive public education campaigns or like advertising. And so, our communications plan is mostly working on how do we support other organizations? How do we support individuals? How do we support grassroots organizing? Sort of that earned media and like other people sort of pushing the message forward.
Thanks. Doug, you were going to say something?
Basically, just what Zach said. There's a plan. There's resources, but they're vastly less than what we need to do a comprehensive media campaign. And it's just about doing what we can with the resources that we have and leveraging partner organizations to help push the message out.
Thank you. Another one. Do any of you have specific plans to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement coming up this December? Anybody?
We're going to be having an online climate forum in the beginning of December, basically to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the plan's adoption, and we'll be incorporating recognition of Paris in that.
Okay, I'm looking to see what else is here. A comment, North Central Texas has a regional codes coordinating committee which tries to coordinate regional adoption of optional parts of building codes, including ones that may affect decarbonization. Would anyone like to comment on city involvement in building codes as a path to climate plan implementation, either in their own cities or regionally?
Yeah, the city of Dallas plans to work with that group to update our building codes in compliance with the regional effort and the CCAP. So that is an effort that we are looking at working on this fiscal year.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments on that? Let's see. So I'm trying to distinguish between.
I would just add that that is one of those levers that the city actually does have, and it is essential that there's I'm not exactly familiar with all the details on this, but I think the way that it works sort of in Austin is that our development services process organization, part of the city, runs building an energy code revision process every 2 to 3 years, and they involve stakeholders. They start with the International Energy Code, and then they work through and they adopt local amendments. And those local amendments are essential tools, especially in cities where there's a lot of redevelopment and there's lots of new construction going on. So codes around energy efficiency, codes around solar ready, EV ready, electrification ready, all of these things are essential for the building sector, especially in a place like Austin and a lot of places in Texas where there is a lot of growth and ongoing construction. So it's not going to be an immediate win or something that dramatically pulls down emissions, but it's essential to control future emissions.
To keep them from growing, yeah. Oh, yeah, and there's someone else, a graduate student, had a question for you, Zach, around this a little bit. So it said, and you've answered some of this, what does the city of Austin still need to measure regarding the impact of climate change on current building performance for buildings built to code, and then also energy efficiency, waste management? What kind of metrics do you have in place right now? How do you actually measure the carbon budget, if you will?
Well, we don't do it building by building. We get aggregated total kilowatt hour sales, total CO2 stack emissions, total natural gas sales. We just get the aggregated total. So we don't really have like building by building data. There is, it's called ECAD, Energy Conservation Audit and Disclosure Ordinance. There is an ordinance that requires buildings over a certain size to like track their energy usage and report that usage using Portfolio Manager. But again, it's not all the buildings, and it's not like exact use. So it's a challenging thing to try to go like building by building across the entire city when that data like isn't available.
Yeah, I would imagine fanning out and doing that would be near impossible.
Yeah.
Let's see, another question. What is one of the biggest scientific or technological challenges to implementing your city's climate action plans that we haven't already discussed? Anyone around technology? I mean, we know we have a lot of sociological and economic questions. What around technology itself?
Battery technology, storage of renewables, and either at the grid scale or at the the price and size of batteries that goes in vehicles. I don't know. Longer term, as part of this climate plan, we've been having a lot of conversations about like we got to bring the emissions down. But like looking out beyond like 10 years, we have to be considering like negative emissions and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, whether that's through enhancing our own natural systems of trees and soils or using other technologies. Like we're at the point where that's going to have to be like a more serious part of the conversation, I think. I mean, not this year, but in the coming years. So there's going to be some lead time.
Great, thank you.
This is Laura. I would add to that recycling. That recycling is a huge issue where we have like a gap between technology seems to be moving farther away from what cities are capable of doing, and that's going to become a bigger problem as things move forward, and it's going to become a costlier problem as things move forward.
And if I could build on that,
go ahead.
I think that to build on that, just the whole evolution of the discussion around circular economy. Getting to the point where materials aren't just being thrown away or recycled, but they're being taken back into the system, and products are designed to be reused. I mean, we just need to come up with another way to look at consumption right now, because it's just not working.
Right. So I had a question there was a great thing on NPR last week about how the plastics industry essentially fooled people, I'll use that word, into thinking that recycling was working when in fact it wasn't. And if you look at energy, many of the states in this country, and Texas had it before and vastly surpassed it. You had a 5,000 megawatt wind goal. Many other states say, here's our renewable portfolio standard. Now it's California, 100% by 2045, Hawaii, 100% by 2045, Maryland, 50% by 2030, and they require industry, utilities, and retailers to prove that X percent of their electricity came from renewables registered resources. It strikes me that in recycling, it doesn't matter how much stuff you throw in the recycling bin if there's not a market for it. Does it seem that we might need to have an RPS so that when Procter & Gamble or one of these other large companies is selling plastic containers, they have to prove that X percent of their plastic comes from recycled? Because the market's not there right now. Is it? Or am I missing something? Any thoughts? Or is that something that... You go ahead then, please.
Yeah, I've worked on a lot of plastics projects. There's some great companies starting to come, but believe it or not, the technology actually hasn't been there until recently. There was technological limitations on how there are 7 different types of plastics. There's certain things you can do with certain types of plastics, whether that's gasifying them into syngas, whether that's reforming them using pyrolysis technology to melt them down and reuse to make new plastics. But it's only recently, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, that the technologies have advanced to the point where it does makes sense to do it, not just from the technology perspective, but from an economic viability perspective. And there are companies, like for those interested, like Brightmark Energy. They're one of the leading companies out there that are transforming plastics, and they just put an RFP out, I think, for over 1.5 million tons of plastic. They're looking for it. They actively want the plastic. And so I think when you see more of those types of companies, there's another one actually out of Dallas that's turning plastics into fuels and have made drop-in diesel that is clear as day out of plastic. I mean, it's amazing, but it's only recently gotten to that point. So I do think in 10 years, we'll be having a very different conversation because the technology is leading the charge that now allows the investment to be economically viable, which now allows the cities to feel confident giving their plastic waste, or to your point, making it useful to actually recycle plastic, knowing that it's probably not just going on a barge to another country, but actually being used for a circular economy purpose. I think we lost Peter again.
Hey guys, it's Brandon. I can hop in, and we're almost out of time, so I just want to thank you guys for being on the panel today. It was fantastic. I'm glad to have you guys back. Really thank Nexus PMG for sponsoring today's webinar, making this possible. And we've actually had some conversations with the British consulate about doing a third part of this series and talking about what the UK is doing, so that might be coming in 2021. But definitely appreciate your guys' participation. For the November webinar, we're actually going to be having Hush Blackwell do a legislative preview for us about what's coming on the state and federal level. So that's coming on November 18th at 12 p.m. But again, thank you everyone for participating. Glad that you're with CleanTech, and definitely appreciate all the panelists for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks,
I'm
everyone.
still here. Sorry about that. Well, we're just about out of time. And I apologize for having lost my connection for a second there. So if I can just get each one of you to offer a benediction of like 30 seconds as we wrap up here in the last 3 minutes. So last words, Ben, if we can start with you.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate, spread the word on the wins. Momentum is driven by consensus of feeling and attitude toward an endeavor. And if everybody can be focused on the positives and what we're doing right and what we're trying to move toward, then it definitely helps move the needle as opposed to the alternative.
Sounds like sage advice. Katie?
Talk about it. Let your representatives, your elected officials know what's important to you at every level. Get involved and vote for the people who align with your beliefs, whatever they are.
Thank you. Laura?
I'm going to copy what Katie said because it is timely and so important to so many things, that decisions are made by the people who show up, and that includes voting.
Thank you. And Doug?
I'm with the other two. Vote local, state, federal.
Great. Thank you. And Zach, last words.
Yep. Show up and participate.
Great, thank you. Well, I do. Before we leave, I want to make sure that everyone's aware the next webinar we have is going to be Wednesday, the 18th of November at 12 p.m., and it's a preview of the federal and state legislative session. So you'll certainly want to turn in for that. It's some of the issues we've talked about today are very, very germane to that conversation as well. I just want to say thank you. I rest easy knowing that we have this level of talent focused on solving these problems, and the skill sets and the ability to communicate that you bring to the table in this really challenging interdisciplinary environment is off the charts, fantastic and impressive. So I look forward to watching your continued success, and I'm hoping CleanTX gives me an opportunity to check back with you all and sometime in the future to measure the progress that you're all making. So thanks again, all of you, for participating in a great conversation, and I wish you all the best in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Take care.